The most important thing of all in your description is the fact that you're aware of all of this. That's what you want to keep in focus, is that presence, that awareness that's watching all this, sees the impression, and then witnesses how this affects you in a sensory way, and then sees the intellectual center give it a label. And in this background, there's this awareness, but this awareness is not conscious as itself. How to be there and be that. That's what's important, not so much what you're seeing or the sensations you're experiencing or the labeling. All of those are happening because that's what we are. If you can keep remembering yourself there, being present there in that background, then by necessity, the labeling can't keep intruding on that. That's conscious will, actually, is what that is. If you can keep being present, conscious will starts to displace the labeling. And now you're just looking at things. And in fact, when those labelings come, you want to keep moving past them or going through them. They are like veils. And when the labeling comes, you want to keep looking through that veil and be aware that you're in this background as awareness. You're looking at the object. And now you're looking even more deeply because the labeling didn't distract you. The labeling comes and it distracts us, and we just stop there. Then we stop observing something, stop seeing it or hearing it. And even your sensations, you don't want to remain in those sensations and think, that's it. Now I've done something right because I'm having this wonderful sensation. In a way, that's your body labeling. That's the instinctive center labeling. It's in its own language, if you like. It's saying wonderful, wonderful impression, good impression. That's also a kind of a label when you think about it. And then the intellectual center, which is slower than the instinctive center, is coming in and doing exactly the same thing, but in its way, with its language, which is words and terms and definitions. It's a matter of coming back and just looking and being aware of looking from where looking looks, being aware from where awareness is being aware. One of the things we used to try was just switching your vision every few seconds. Not in a robotic way, of course, not 1, 2, 3, move eyes, 1, 2, 3, move eyes, but just you look. I'm sitting in my living room, I'm looking at a vase on the mantle, just to look at it for as long as I'm saying this sentence, and then moving my vision to something else, a little mirror that I see next to it, and then something on the wall behind, and just noticing that I am noticing these objects in the room, and noticing that I'm sitting on the couch, noticing them, and noticing that there's something noticing me sitting on the couch, noticing them, noticing them. But that's it. Sounds so funny, doesn't it? But that's it. Nobody's doing this, you see? Nobody's doing this throughout their day on planet Earth. Most people, they're not doing that. And you can't do this accidentally. You have to be conscious. And you can roam the panorama of your environment and just notice things. But then, of course, what happens? The labels come, the sensations come, the emotions come. And then off we go, randomly associating with all those things. And soon, what we're just seeing a vague world around us. We only notice then what's right in our way as we're walking or something. We don't really. When's the last time you took a serious art tour of your own home and looked at all the paintings? And I do this sometimes. I do an art tour. I just spend 10 minutes looking at some of the art instead of knowing it's there on the wall and I'm accustomed to where it is on the wall, to stop and look at it and be there and take in the impression and look at it from where looking looks, and keep moving through the veil of label, of sensation, even of the sense of appreciation, which is that's the emotional center's way of labeling. It's this, this is so beautiful, but without those words, of course. But the emotional center is also vibrating in response to something, just as the instinctive center is vibrating with sensation and the intellectual center is vibrating with words. This is what taking in impressions is about. These impressions come in, and then usually they just stop right there at those labels, and they don't keep coming back to awareness. And then awareness cannot go back to them. This is why with divided attention, that idea, just notice something in your environment. I'm looking at a pillow on the couch across from me. Just look at it, notice it, and be aware of it, and then be aware, and now switch back the other way, the arrow, and now just be aware of yourself where you are looking at it, and be aware of yourself sitting or standing or walking. And then go back to the pillow and look at it again, and then come back, and then go to something else, and then come back to you as awareness, and then go out again to an object, and then come back. And you can do this with thoughts and emotions too. Look at the thought that's coming through. Look at that story. For example, we were talking about stories the other day. Look at the story and then come back and look from where looking is looking at that story. And then gradually this back and forth will become closer and closer. It's one. Now you're aware at exactly the same time, and in a way in exactly the same space. You're noticing an object, you're noticing something, and it's happening at the same time. And now divided attention is no longer divided, it's one. Double attention becomes awareness, becomes one. And the most important thing of all is not what you notice and not how you react to what you notice, but the fact of your being able to notice it and being aware of it as of that. Notice that you are noticing. That's the main thing. The rest will take care of itself. From the perspective of awareness, there can begin to be a unification or oneness. It's not from the point of view of the centers, though. And it's not from the point of view of the feeling of me as a person. Everything is separate in that dimension. The lower dimension cannot just access the higher dimension, the next higher dimension, even by wanting to. Each higher dimension has to realize itself, and then when it does, it immediately absorbs the lower dimensions that are inside of it. We just keep trying to be present. Just keep trying to be aware, keep trying to notice that we're noticing everything about and it begins with us. That's why we study the centers. We're trying to notice each of the centers operating, the energy level, the thoughts, the emotions, the eyes, the moods, the plans, the activity. We're noticing first, as the fourth way says, we become objective toward ourselves. This objectivity regarding the outside world, that can't happen until our awareness transcends the identity of being a person. That's what the fourth state is. You cannot just go there without passing through the other dimension, the third state. And this means, for example, if we have a story and it's very intense, first you see it and you think you're in this engrossing film inside yourself, and you believe it, and you're feeling all that. You actually think it's true, that it's real, and then you start to see, wait a minute, this is inside. And then it becomes more of a novel. Instead of it being an engrossing film, it becomes a novel because you're not as identified, but it's still there. The mind is still turning the pages of that novel, of that story, and reading it with interest. And then later, the novel becomes just almost a cartoon, a comic book. Now you have the same story perhaps happen inside of you, but it's more as though you're reading a comic book. And most people are so identified that they think it's an engrossing film that all the time, their life. And mostly their psychology, their internal world, feels like the film in which they are engrossed. And then it starts to become gradually just a novel, and then, as I say, a comic book. And then because it's now a comic book, it's of no interest. It becomes less interesting. And every time you pick up that comic book. I don't want to read that. I don't want to read that anymore. I'm not interested in that. What happens is all of this internal life, feeling of life and identity, ceases to be of interest. And this is when we turn our attention outward. And then the world becomes our study. And this is what will happen eventually is we will cease to need to study and observe ourselves because we will no longer be identified. And our awareness will no longer be identified, and we'll be able to turn its attention to the outside world and start observing the world and humanity in exactly the same way that we were observing our internal world. But now we will have reached a point of being objective toward that internal world. It won't distract us, it won't lure us in, it won't deceive us. We will no longer be in that ignorance, no longer deceived by that ignorance of believing that is who we are. We'll shift to a much bigger dimension and look at the world in exactly the same way we were looking at our inner world. And in fact, they're the same, operating on the same principles and the same laws and the same tendencies, but on a bigger scale. And of course, even beyond that, we won't be able to afford to be stuck in that puzzle either. We don't want to be engrossed in that as a film either. We want even the outside world as we perceive it to eventually become a novel and then a comic book and then of no interest and go beyond even that. Ultimately, awareness has this potential not to be identified with anything. But for us, we're so tangled up in our inner world and in our sensations and emotions and thoughts. We are struggling, you could say, we're trying to intuit our way out of this dimension. Just if we can get to the outer perimeter of this dimension, we will be backing up against the transparent wall that is the next dimension. And awareness then transmutes and it pops out into the next dimension, bigger, deeper, more profound dimension. And then does the same thing, tries not to identify with what it sees, what it's witnessing. It's odd that in a way for us, human beings on earth, or being in this form of a human on earth, on a planet, this is how it starts. Simply by being aware of ourselves in our environment, noticing how we are as a body and a mind, as four centers, how we are responding to our environment, what effect that has on us internally in terms of senses, thoughts, sensations, thoughts, emotions, and movement. This is where we begin here. This is our classroom.